And welcome back. You're watching The Globe here on SABC News Channel, independent and impartial. I am Tshepiso Makwetla. Libyan security forces have arrested hundreds of migrants, asylum seekers and refugees who had been camped in front of a UN refugee center in the Libyan capital of Tripoli since October last year. The troops came overnight, smashed up the protest site and arrested hundreds. Human rights activists say the detainees have been sent to a detention center in the nearby town of Ain Zara, but others managed to flee from the raid. Now, Tariq Lamloum works with the local Baladi organization for human rights. He says at least one migrant community leader has been shot during the raid. The migrants, including women and children, have been camping outside the center in Tripoli since October last year. They are seeking protection following a massive crackdown on refugees and asylum seekers. They're also demanding better treatment at the hands of Libyan authorities. The Norwegian Refugee Council and the International Rescue Committee says more than 600 people have been detained in the raid. Both groups have been urged by Libyan authorities to immediately release those detained and provide them with protection from further violence. We speak now to Alexandra Saieh, who is Advocacy Manager for the Norwegian Refugee Council in Libya. She's based in neighbouring Tunisia and speaks to us from the capital, Tunis. Alexandra, very good evening to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. I'm really struck by the irony that this attack on the migrants happened just outside the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees Center, which many migrants said left them without recourse. What are we to read into what happened there?
Well, it's a very challenging situation. In the early morning hours on Monday, Monday, January 10th, security forces came in and rounded up more than 600 migrants and refugees that were camped out in front of the center. They had been there for around 3 months, asking for protection, asking to be evacuated. This all started back in October 2021, when the Libyan authorities rounded up more than 5,000 migrants and refugees in the city of Tripoli. It was the largest crackdown that we had seen in recent years in a 24-hour period. All of those detained were sent to detention centers. A week after that, in early October, there were about 2,000 that managed to escape, and many fled to the center because they simply had nowhere else to go. Part of that raid in October included demolishing. They demolished homes housing many vulnerable migrants. Many were evicted from their homes, and it became extremely difficult for people to simply rent an apartment in Tripoli. And so many people just went to the center, stood outside because they were seeking safety and didn't have any other option. So this crackdown, excuse me, yeah.
So you mentioned that this happened before, therefore was this particular crackdown a surprise? But more importantly, the protests came to an end on January 10 when the CDC was officially closed. That's a month after UNHCR announced that it would be shut due to the growing crowd of people in front of the building's entrances. Is there political pressure underlying this decision, despite the fact that UNHCR says it was a practical move because no work could be done?
Well, I'm really not able to speculate, but what I can say is that it is a very difficult operating environment for humanitarian agencies in Libya. Libya has not signed the 1951 Refugee Convention. Therefore, it makes providing assistance to migrants and refugees in the country extremely difficult. Humanitarian agencies face significant operational challenges in Libya. So this situation at the CDC is one thing, but across the country, it's very difficult to provide assistance to migrants and refugees. Because Libya has not signed the 1951 Refugee Convention, it's not possible to seek asylum in Libya. Refugees are considered, in the eyes of the Libyan authorities, as being there illegally. And irregular migration into Libya is criminalized. And so migrants and refugees, even those registered with UNHCR as asylum seekers, are at risk of arbitrary detention, forced labor, ill treatment. And so these are the conditions facing people who work in Libya.
All right. So let's stay with what you said, that the humanitarian environment there is very difficult. The Office of the UNHCR has said that distribution of cash aid, food assistance, hygiene kits and counselling was never interrupted despite suspension of activities at the CDC, and that's because they've undertaken in different distribution points in Tripoli. Can you confirm this? Is there movement at least in trying to help out these people, even though they don't have a base, so to speak?
Yes, humanitarian assistance has continued throughout the last few months. That was, of course, it's difficult to provide this assistance, and there are challenges, as I elaborated earlier. But assistance has continued being given by humanitarian partners across the country.
Okay. Now, police accuse the migrants and refugees of being involved in suspicious movements around the CDC neighborhood. But I mean, as you said, the reality is that these people have no homes, therefore unable to remain in one place. So is there a difficulty of trust here? I mean, can the migrants really trust the Libyan security forces, given what we've just seen, as we mentioned, the brutal operation in the municipality of Gagaresh, for instance?
I mean, the situation for migrants in Libya is extremely, they're living in very difficult conditions. As I mentioned, they don't have legal status in the country. And this is not the first crackdown we've seen. It's the second crackdown we've seen in the last 3 to 4 months. And it's happened before. It happens it happens very frequently. And so it's no surprise that there is distrust. As I mentioned, migrants and refugees are at risk of a range of protection abuses, protection risks in Libya. And, it's over the last 10 years, with the sort of security vacuum left after the 2011 uprising, the situation has only become more and more volatile.
Okay. So given this environment, the protesters are calling for freedom and safety. In an ideal world, what would it look like? What is possible?
In an ideal world, European governments would scale up safe pathways to seek safety abroad, to seek resettlement. We would see increased evacuation flights for the most vulnerable. We would see migrants in the country to be able to access legal status, to apply for legal residency, to go through some sort of procedure to access work permits, to access residency in the country. We would see the Libyan government allow humanitarian agencies and the UN to process a refugee determination status, a respect for the Refugee Convention, a respect for human rights. We're calling on the authorities now to release those who have been detained, particularly women, children, and asylum seekers. But at the same time, we need them to be able to, for them to also access housing legally, a safe place to go. So in addition to being able to calling for the release of people from detention, we also want them to be able to access shelter in a safe and legal manner.
All right. You mentioned Libya's role, the role of Libya's Directorate for Combating Illegal Migration. What is it? You've already mentioned what the international community can do, but how can this office work in hand with the international community?
I mean, that department manages the detention centers. It's not. I'm not able to comment on exactly what their activities consist of. I would refer that question to them. But I think overall we need to see more cooperation, more working together between the Libyan authorities and the humanitarian community to make the lives of migrants and refugees better and to allow people to live in dignity.
Okay, so the migrants want to be evacuated to third countries. What do they mean by this, and which ones would be willing to take them in from your assessment or from the conversations that you hear?
I mean, worldwide, we're seeing many countries are not offering resettlement, places for resettlement. So I think globally, we need to see countries scale this up. We've called on European states to do this. But we also need to see it across the board in high-income countries. I'm not able to say who exactly is willing to do this. I know in the past there have been resettlement places offered by Canada and Norway and others, but we do need to see this immediately. Last year in 2021 and before that in 2020, we were very few people managed to access resettlement from Libya. And so we really would like to see this scale up in 2022.
All right, thank you so much for speaking to us. Alexandra Saieh, she is the Advocacy Manager for Norwegian Refugee Council in Libya, speaking to us about that crackdown on refugees, migrants and asylum seekers in Libya.